thank you again, and I want to thank everyone for attending this paper presentation. I want to begin by offering a few words about my methods here. It is pretty common to use philosophy as a lens to explain a poem, play, or a novel. Our lecturers at the English departments frequently assign literary texts alongside philosophical readings, but they sometimes do not consider reconfiguring thought by way of reading literature. And today I want to subvert this method. Instead of using philosophy or another external discipline to understand a literary text, I want to show how Shakespeare helps us rethink continental philosophy here. I want to tell you how Shakespeare lets us think about resistance philosophically and how he also politicizes philosophical thought. I believe that my methodical approach here is as significant as the contents of this very presentation, because it enacts a sort of resistance to the submission of literature by other disciplines. I hope this makes sense. So now, let me proceed by suggesting the stakes. I'm looking at a story that starts with Plato and runs through Shakespeare, Lacan, Derrida, and Kristeva. So to begin with, about 2.5 millennia ago, Plato asks the question, if the physical world is always decaying, how can it be the ground for existence? Being a man of reason, he assumed that the universe must have a constant law. For him, change leads to chaos, and that you cannot base reality on the chaotic. Since the body is transitory, he argued that the persistent reality must be something noetic. He termed these persistent non-bodily realities as the ideals, or eidos in his lexicon, and described the material existence as the icon or econ. He thus created a hierarchy, and this is important, and he argued that bodies are just veils over reality that need to be controlled and exhausted by judgment. But I have to say that my interest in Plato here today is not detached or purely theoretical, but it is political, because I see this same Platonic outlook in different strands of authoritarianism. Of course, we can see how Puritanism or the Islamic State force people to fit abstract concepts such as chastity or modesty. And if we look close enough, we can see fascism or Stalinism as simplified modalities of Platonism, as they can be understood in terms of the oppression of the body through universalized concepts such as unity, ordination, or martyrdom, and other concepts like that. And this then, of course, extends to capitalism. It identifies people with their contribution to the accumulation of the capital, and capitalism describes their bodies and desires as excess to be controlled. And as we'll see in Shakespeare, this excess is exactly what resists the totalitarian states. So in short, the Platonic view that demeans the body underwrites all these sorts of all these forms of oppression. Right. So in Plato, the unchanging mental concepts are considered to be ontological, that they are about existence and what exists. So they are assumedly above the earthly register of politics, but I say they actually set the stage for a fascistic containment of the body, so it is pretty political. And also, once we set the question as whether the concept of a universal and eternal truth that precedes the body is viable, we can observe the regulation of entities by mental categories as a hermeneutic problem too. So Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra illustrates this perfectly. Antony is tried to be trapped by the concept of the Roman general throughout the play. His desires, his marriage, and all his intimacies are prescripted by this title. His identity is forced to be enclosed by the name, turning his passion into imperial interest, I'd say. When we see that the prioritization of abstractions over bodies is what actually reinforces political control, philosophy becomes politicized and relevant. And I want to tell you that Shakespeare wrote with this exact sensibility, and this made him sort of antidotal to Plato. Now, so in order to show you this, I'll compare the Shakespearean trio of Octavius, Antony, and Cleopatra with Plato's ideals, bodies, and the third element that he describes as what translates ideals into bodies, which he names Cora in his dialogue titled Timaeus. He also calls these three figures the father, son, and mother, so following the Oedipal structure. So in this comparison, in this setup, Octavius maps onto the Platonic ideal, or the modal form as Plato calls it. Octavius is not really a man of flesh, I'd say, but he's more like a concept. And this is pretty important in understanding how the imperial logic works. Some critics describe him as dry, lifeless, charmless, and critics such as A.C. Bradley suggest that he has plenty of judgment, but not much blood. Bradley also posits that Octavius is an agent of reason against which an individual's intentions mean nothing. And I suggest that Octavius is a concept, a body without desire, whose only drive is the interest of the empire. Through him, Shakespeare shows that Plato's pure reason is actually a political tool backed by military force. In this play, the political friction between Octavius and Antony stems from Antony's transformation. Once a perfect general, like Octavius, he becomes a carnal creature and stops serving the empire. He fails to fit a symbol that is useful for the empire by pursuing prohibited pleasures, or what Jacques Lacan would call jouissance. And in describing this, Lacan is ever refreshing in reminding us that desire isn't just a private or psychological affair, but it is coded through politics. And Shakespeare posits this sort of by describing Antony's affair with Cleopatra as a political act of resistance. In order to show the dichotomy between Octavius and Antony as the Cartesian duality between mind and body, I have to reference John Middleton Murray, who argues that Enobarbus is torn between mind and heart, implying Enobarbus's inner struggles. But I believe that we can push this metaphor further by seeing the mind as Octavius and the heart as Antony within a Cartesian sort of dualism. And this is evidenced when Antony is branded as lascivious, libertine, and adulterous surfeiter. These are descriptions that explicitly foreground his bodily existence. In the end, failing to control Antony's desire, Octavius compares Antony to a pestilence, claiming that we must, quote, launch diseases in our bodies, unquote. And of course, we can recast the phrasing diseases in our bodies as diseases as our bodies, where the flesh itself is the plague that troubles power. So yes, Antony appears as the carnal individual who must be contained, while Octavius is a body already neutralized by abstraction and deployed to contain others. The imperial regime survives only by transforming tangible realities into intellectual constructs. So if Antony cannot be abstracted into a general, he will be abstracted into an enemy. And Octavius tries this, abstracting Antony by labeling him, quote, a man who is the abstract of all faults, unquote. I'm not sure now that if I can accept Antony as embodying the abstraction of all human defects, I'm not sure if it is a fair description of Antony. Rather, it appears to me that perceiving individuals in conceptual terms serves as a deliberate political maneuver orchestrated by Octavius. So far, the play foregrounds the empire's unease with the flesh and desire's capacity for rebellion. Ultimately, Shakespeare shows us that judgment isn't just a neutral mental faculty, but a political weapon for expunging the body. And this is most apparent when Octavius deploys the notion of judgment to forbid Antony his pleasures. He says, quote, "'Tis to be chid, as we rate boys who, being mature in knowledge, pawn their experience to their present pleasure, and so rebel to judgment," unquote. As Octavius defeats Antony, the bodies that are assimilated in the symbols are turned against those that resist, and Eros is terminated by the disciplinary concept of judgment. But at this point, I would ask, but what about Cleopatra, right? Is she merely a dummy for manifesting Antony's resistant libidinal energies, or does her singular, unique existence complicate this entire structure? And I believe that Cleopatra occupies this third sort of quadratic space. She mediates Antony's metamorphosis, receiving a citizen and a universalized category, a general, and yielding a flesh and blood individual, an alien who is also a lover. She is defined by a hermeneutic volatility and aligns with Plato and Christaber's Cora in that sense. Conforming to the Platonic description of the term, she's understood by a kind of, quote, bastard reasoning, unquote. So she enacts a grammar that upholds contradiction without resolving it. She's a space, a sort of semiotic container where the citizen meets the alien, where the lover meets the traitor, or in Octavius's case, where the adversary meets the ally. Plato also writes that Cora is, quote, neither sensible nor intelligible, unquote, and Cleopatra fits that description perfectly. Bernard ten Brink posits that the qualities that make her sovereign and wonderful, quote, laugh at definition, unquote. Furthermore, she's portrayed as a gypsy, an enchantress, magician, even magic itself. And these titles suggest that she exists outside the domain of reason, much like Plato's Cora, which he defines as hardly an object of conviction. So Cleopatra epitomizes the erratic nature when she instructs her messenger to report her as dancing if Antony is sad, or sick if Antony is merry. She resists corresponding to a single concept, and as she eludes interpretive enclosure, like Antony, one might expect her to circumvent instrumentalization. But unlike Antony, she capitulates to the teleological economy, the instrumentalism that Plato formulates. In the play, Shakespeare employs but subverts this Platonic scheme, configuring Cleopatra as a political device rather than a metaphysical one. So Cleopatra's function is to transform Antony the general into a carnal individual, but only to have him defeated by Rome. If it weren't for Cleopatra's betrayal in the play, we couldn't be so sure if Antony would be defeated by the Roman forces. The tragedy intimates that Cleopatra is an implement with an end by also having her consumed once she performs her function, once Antony dies and the resistant body is eradicated. At bottom, she appears to evade totalitarian seizure through her apolitical posture. But however, I suppose Shakespeare suggests that such neutrality is mere opportunism and that it ultimately serves power. So if Octavius proves that the universal truth is an instrument for naturalizing authority, and if Antony's drama manifests that Eros opens a plurality of meaning that totalitarian regimes cannot tolerate, Cleopatra's portrayal suggests that desire and meaning that are purportedly unmoored from purpose actually consolidate hegemonic authority rather than undermining it. Labeling Cora a wet nurse and a surrogate, Plato reduces this notion to a passive vessel, not a source of resistance. And the reader in his reconceptualization of Cora confirms that Plato's father, this ideal, this modal figure represented by Octavius, imposes a telic principle, a purpose upon the son, while leaving mother and son without agency. On the other hand, he views Cora as a protective veil that delays a final meaning. So Cleopatra mirrors this as she holds Antony back from identifying with the fixed symbol of a triumvir, for instance. And I believe the most important implication here is that fixing the meaning or conceiving the body as secondary to a fixed meaning is synonymized by the reader and Shakespeare with regulating and purposing the body and making it useful for a system, and this is political. The reader certainly has this political perspective, but Shakespeare makes it explicit. I believe now hermeneutics is not only about the question if a fixed meaning is possible, but it is also about exploring who oppresses how and using what. In brief, if the reader explores the politics of Platonic hermeneutics, Shakespeare employs a chiasmic subversion and he explores the Platonic hermeneutics of imperial politics. Shakespeare also adds that eroticism, or love, you may say, produces a resistance to sort of critical anesthesia or any fixation of purpose. It liberates, Eros liberates you from being useful. The forbidden pleasure, termed jouissance by Lacan, is what makes you resist being translated into a universal concept, as Antony shows us. And this is the hermeneutics of resistance in a Shakespearean sense. Lastly, I want to close with a concise reference to Kristeva and Shakespeare's potential insight into her view. To understand her view, we must also grasp Lacan's symbolic, so I'm going to touch upon it. And to illustrate this concept, we can just imagine a child. The family goes to a beach the kid collects pebbles. At the end of the trip, the parents force the child to leave the pebbles behind. So the parents enact a violence that severes the child from material reality. This rupture compels the child to trade the tangible objects for a symbol, which is a mental representation of the material thing, and they force the kid to accept conventional and imposed values. By substituting raw experience with concepts, the child enters a system where desire is mediated and appropriated by political, economic, and social imperatives. And Kristeva defines Kara as a pre-symbolic space where meaning is detached from authorities' codes. And while Plato and Neoplatonics such as Plotinus and Augustine may believe that meaning can exist apart from politics, Shakespeare and Derrida would argue that it is always bound to power. So crucially, Shakespeare shows that refusing to assume any meaning at all, as Cleopatra does, doesn't liberate you from politics. Rather, it turns you into an instrument through which authority sustains itself. And a Shakespearean reading would suggest that Kristeva's fantasy of decoupling meaning from symbols is mere regression, a childish sort of coping mechanism. While it is romantic, it is not something that enables you to resist. I believe that I have no time to summarize my overarching argument, but I hope it made some sense to you. And thank you for your patience.